Today, we're jumping into a really intense moment in American history. We've got two nations standing on the exact same piece of land, and both of them are being forced to answer one of the toughest questions there is. Who are we? Who belongs here?
These aren't just philosophical questions. For people throughout history, the answers have been everything. They can define your entire life, grant you rights, or, just like that, erase your place in the only home you've ever known.
So let's get right into it. We're in Alabama during a time of just massive change. You have the state of Alabama, and you have the sovereign Choctaw Nation, and both are trying to figure out this whole citizenship question. But as you're about to see, why they were asking and the answers they came up with were worlds apart. So, how did we even get here? How did these two nations end up on this collision course? Well, to get that, you have to start with the land itself. It was a contested homeland that, for one people, was their home for generations, and for the other, was a brand new frontier, ready for the taking. What's really wild about this timeline is just how fast everything happened. I mean, think about it. In just 15 years, land that was the absolute heart of the Choctaw Nation gets turned into a U.S. territory and then a state. The real turning point, though, is that Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830. This wasn't just some land deal. This was the legal document that forced tens of thousands of Choctaw people off the land their families had lived on for centuries. In this quote from the great Choctaw leader, Pushmataha, it just says it all. He said this years before that final treaty, and he was trying to make people understand that land wasn't just a thing you could chop up and sell. It was whole. It was essential to their identity. Giving up half of it was like destroying the entire nation. So that brings us to our next chapter. After that traumatic removal, the Choctaw Nation, now mostly in what was called Indian Territory, had a totally new problem. How do you legally rebuild a nation? And a huge piece of that puzzle was defining, with pen and paper, who was officially a citizen. And at the very core of their new laws was this idea, citizen by blood. Now, this was way more than just ancestry. It was a specific legal status. It was the key that unlocked your rights to land, to resources, to having a say in your nation. Honestly, it was an act of survival, of sovereign self-preservation. But here's the thing, right? Anytime you draw a circle to define who's in, you're also, by default, drawing a pretty sharp line defining who's out. And the Choctaw Nation's laws were very, very clear about that. And this is where things get really complicated, because they created these different legal categories inside their own society. First, Choctaw law made it a felony to marry a black person. Then, for the black people who had been enslaved by some tribal members, they created a whole separate class by treaty, the Choctaw freedmen. Now, they had certain rights, but they were explicitly not citizens by blood. To change that, you had to file a formal petition and go through this whole legal process to prove your Choctaw heritage. Okay, so let's shift gears and jump back over to Alabama. While the Choctaw were defining who belonged based on bloodlines and heritage, the U.S. government was coming in and forcing a whole new definition of citizenship on the South, especially right after the Civil War. Which brings us to this number. The 15th Amendment wasn't just a little change in the law. It was a political earthquake. More than 100,000 black men in Alabama could now legally vote. This wasn't a slow trickle. It was a sudden, fundamental change to the entire power structure of the state. And these new voters, they didn't just stay home. They got organized, fast. Groups like the Union League became these incredible political machines, registering and getting thousands of newly empowered black citizens to the polls. All of a sudden, African Americans were a major political force. And the backlash was immediate and fierce. This quote from historian Walter Fleming, it really nails the feeling of alarm that swept through Alabama's white establishment. And it was that alarm, that fear of losing control, that led directly to this huge, calculated push to take all that newfound power away. Okay, so now we're at the turn of the 20th century. This is the moment where it all comes to a head, where both the Choctaw Nation and the state of Alabama move to finalize, once and for all, who they consider a citizen. This slide, right here, shows you the whole story in just a few words. At the exact same time, in the same part of the world, two governments are making official lists of their people. But just look at the language. The Choctaw Nation's goal? To finalize the tribal rolls. That's about making a complete list, a project of inclusion. Alabama's goal? To purify the electorate. That's a project of exclusion.
So for the Choctaw, the process was basically an official accounting. The criteria were pretty clear: people with Choctaw blood, their kids, and others who had legally become part of the nation. The whole point was to get a complete and accurate list of all their people.
Alabama's new constitution, though, was basically a machine built to disenfranchise people. It was this three-step attack. First, a poll tax that priced out poor farmers, black and white. Second, a literacy test that gave all the power to white registrars to fail any black person they wanted. And third, the grandfather clause, which was a backdoor for illiterate white people to vote while making sure the descendants of slaves couldn't use it.
And we have to remember, these laws, these rules, they weren't just abstract ideas. They were lines drawn on paper that had huge, life-changing impacts on real people who were just trying to fight for their identity and their rights.
To really see the human side of this, let's look at two men who actually fought back. In Alabama, you have Jackson W. Giles, a black man who sued the state after they wouldn't let him register to vote. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. At the same time, a man named Delbert Green was fighting his own battle, trying to get the government to move his name from the Choctaw Freedmen list to the Citizens by Blood list. At the end of the day, both men were just fighting to get their name on the right piece of paper.
For Jackson Giles, the outcome was just devastating. In 1903, the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, it really looks like a massive fraud is happening in Alabama, but we're powerless to stop it. They said the courts couldn't enforce political rights if a state was just that determined to take them away.
And this quote from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., it's just bone-chilling. He's essentially saying that even if the court ordered Alabama to put Giles's name on the voting roll, the conspiracy to stop him from voting was so huge that a court order would be totally meaningless. It's a shocking admission of how powerless the law can be against widespread, state-sponsored racism.
So we're left with this incredible parallel story. One nation using the law to try and preserve its identity, and another using the law to enforce a racial hierarchy. And it forces us to ask a question that still matters so much today. When we use laws to draw lines between people, who gets to hold the pen? And what's the real cost for the people who get drawn out?